Hello. You guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Boris, just heard you. The best ever.
Boris, do you need to go and come back?
No, he sounds great for the first time.
I think that was Brainstormer.
No, it's zero. Boris sounds perfect.
Is it?
Does that mean I'm in the same sound cell that you were in? Because I hear you perfectly. Okay.
Wait,
I guess
who?
I'm logging off and coming back.
I don't hear Boris.
Yeah, I don't hear him either.
Yeah, I hear Keith. I didn't know Keith was messing with us or not. Like I can hear Boris. I can exactly.
No, I was talking to him. He was perfectly. He was the clearest he's ever been on one of these things.
Okay, how about now?
There we go.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, well, I think that we can go ahead and get started. I can share some of the thoughts that are on my mind for the day for us to work through. I think that the sort of the next big outcome that we as a group can produce is a HIP that would enable us to basically incentivize deployments in places where they are useful, whatever that HIP may look like. We have discussed two sort of summary drafts of thoughts that we threw together from our side. One was around carrier hex boosting, where any service provider on the network, like Helium Mobile, would have the ability to basically mark up certain hexes informed by the discovery mapping data, where there is a lot of data usage that is going to TMO, yet there is no coverage, and boost those hexes using some formula, and there's a table with some thoughts. And the other was the Oracle hex boosting, which is kind of tackling the problem from the other end, meaning using some external data source like zoning data or some external mobile location database data to basically do the same thing, to basically boost the hexes, but it's going to be done in a less pointed way, and the objective is to just basically effectively like eliminate rewards or minimize rewards for hexes that are likely least useful, like middle of the ocean or whatever. So I think that I'm kind of, still in the process of gathering ideas and putting these drafts together. I think that probably it might even make sense to combine these two into like a single HIP. And one thing I wanted to discuss here is just, some ideas on how to structure it. And there is maybe like more radical ways of doing it and less radical ways of doing it. The more radical we go, the more precise we can get with respect to pointing people towards like the exact locations where the deployments should happen. But at the same time, like the more precise and the more narrow we become, and the more sort of an outsized rewards scenario we offer in a handful of locations, the less rewards will go to some of the early people that may have, for example, deployed in locations that may be suboptimal, but they've deployed because the guidance we've given so far was fairly high level and to the tune of like slow moving people. One of the ideas that I see we're like having a bot attack or something. Do we need to take care of it before we proceed, or can we just ignore it? Okay.
Yeah, let's just hear these bots out. They may have a point.
Oh yeah. Okay. So just to be more specific and like give more specific examples of what I mean by more radical ideas. So like we haven't gone very deep, I think, into when we boost a hex, let's say a service provider boosts a hex, like how much can you boost it, right? We can lock in some mobile into a hex, but how much can you boost it? Like, is it like 2x the points of anything? Is it 5x? Is it 10x? Or is it 100x? And depending on how pointed we want to be, that number can be higher. There is another idea that I heard from some of the folks at Nova, which is not without merit and maybe is worth chatting about a little bit, is that you can go as far as going like all the way to basically like just grandfather certain locations where there are radios deployed already because people have invested money, and obviously people should be getting ROI on their existing investment, and then effectively like lock all the other hexes, period. So there's no rewards on any other hexes except those that have been explicitly unlocked by service providers on the network. And the unlocked hexes will provide like a virtual guarantee of data and significantly outsized rewards, but it's only in the certain locations where there is guarantee of data usage that people can expand the deployment beyond like already the existing current sort of grandfathered footprint, which is kind of like the extreme version of hex boosting, so to speak, but again would enable us to really be very precise about where people deploy and get a lot more usage and a lot more data on the on the network. So I just want to maybe I'll pause here. These are just and then the other topic we should discuss is like useful coverage, which I saw there's some debate about what it is or what it is not, but I don't know, maybe we should discuss that as like a separate thing. But those are kind of related, sort of, like the locking, unlocking hexes and what we consider useful coverage. But maybe just pause here and see if anybody has any thoughts on we should, break.
Yes, I think high level, we don't want to have a limit to what that boost could be, because if, let's say, Helium Mobile needs something there tomorrow and there's going to be data usage, like if they want 1,000 extra rewards and that leads to a ton of data usage, like we don't want to stop that. So I think we make a scale, and again, I haven't gone and done the math on this yet, but we make a scale where you can, Helium Mobile or whatever service provider, stakes a certain amount of mobile tokens towards an area to boost it. The more they stake, the more it's boosted. With that boost comes some guarantee of some amount of data transfer that should happen in that area. And if a data transfer doesn't happen by a certain date, and again, very high level, haven't really gotten into the details of this, that's when the slashing of the stake starts to occur to make up for the extra rewards that went to an area that didn't actually get the necessary data transfer.
Okay. And what do you think is the right way to think about sort of like the proportions? So like, because
I think we can think of it in terms of like the incremental amount of mobile given out to those hexes. Essentially, if that amount of mobile doesn't also get rewarded for data transfer by, let's call it 3 months, we can work on the time period, the grace period. But if that amount of data transfer doesn't get rewarded in that time, that's when you slash the amount of extra rewards that were given out. So you could, as someone setting up a radio in a boosted location, you get the proof of coverage rewards and the data transfer rewards if they both come. If the data transfer never comes, then you get boosted rewards. But then those boosted rewards come from the amount of mobile staked by the service provider. So the network then doesn't have a area where they are paying out extra for no reason. Someone else is paying out that extra by proxy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think I hear what you're saying. One point that is worth talking about is when we boost a hex, does the extra mobile that the person that's created coverage in the boosted hex come explicitly from, so it's like a service provider sending their mobile almost into that hex, and then the person that's created coverage is getting it, or the service provider is like locking it and potentially burning it, but then the amount of points that is earnable out of that hex for a certain period of time is significantly higher than if it wasn't boosted.
Yep. Yeah. So they're locking it, and then it gets burned if the data transfer doesn't actually come to that area.
Okay. Yeah. So then this is very much consistent with the original draft that we've discussed last time.
Yep. Yeah. No, I like that, and I like that as the better lever than the Oracle one. I think Oracle could be used to devalue certain hexes that we decide have no value at all. But the more I think about it, the more I think that the service providers know where they want coverage best, and we should lean on them to incentivize the areas that they want.
I guess I agree and disagree with that. The main thing I worry about is future prediction is going to be, yeah, it'll be known. Like, obviously, as Helium Mobile rolls out, they're going to choose to start. But I don't. I guess there's a lot of different things that can be built into that. Like, I don't like in some of the modeling I was looking at in terms of trying to basically create oracles that determine what is likely to be good now and or say not now but in future. You want to have a general way of pushing people towards good place, and to do, because people, you don't want to just limit to people who live in the three starting cities or the 10 starting cities, whatever it ends up actually being. You actually want to just say cover as many people as you physically can, and we will front end that to some degree. And the best way to calculate that, I think, is with multi-layered oracles. I guess to explain that idea, it would be like there are some simple ones. One of them I had pointed out was they kind of just have a baseline rural, suburban, and urban layering model that you could just almost drag and drop it into the hexes and just let them self-calculate. And then there's more complicated ones like just sheer sheer man hour existence. periods, or traffic is another one that you. And then on top of that, I think data, or even like you would say, imminent data of like what other telcos are reporting as high usage. I think that you can, if you layer those all, kind of combine it into some sort of like a heat map. That way, people can look at it, visualize it, understand where a good place would be. That's going to be one of the keys unlocking people who aren't so steeped into this. Just saying, okay, go to this map, and it'll show you if you can get into these places that this would be good. And then you just boom, you go straight over to the calculator or the simulator that's upcoming, and say, okay, I can get to this place, I can get this high, this is what my rewards will be. And if people can do that kind of value calculation, then you will not, people won't just go into this blindly and then get miffed when they can't figure out why I'm not making as much as I think I should. You give them the tools, and I think that will allow growth of the network to grow exponentially, especially once kind of known and once we work out all the bugs and understand. And I think that the main key to that is also weighting the oracles based on which ones turn out to be the most useful. I actually personally taking telco's current usage probably the most valuable one, but that might be also the most expensive one. Talked about, but just taking something as simple as through the Google Maps, rural, urban, and suburban is still useful knowledge. Open to suggestions about how we might go about doing it. That's kind of my radical idea about it.
Yeah, so this is the Oracle hex boosting thing that we've discussed basically. So like it's I mean there's value in that, and they can assume that, for example, the reason, like the situation where it would not make sense to do anything on that front is if, for example, we say just like, no hexes except those where the service providers have explicitly staked mobile are rewardable, period. Or like a middle ground of it is like, okay, we just pass a HIP and say that everybody who's deployed, up to now, okay, they remain rewardable because they've deployed and they've invested and they believed in the network early. But from here on forward, nothing else is rewardable except the ones that have been explicitly boosted by the service providers.
I think that's way too aggressive.
It's way too aggressive, yeah?
I think that's
okay.
I think
I think we overestimate the effect that like 10x boosting on some radios
I agree.
on the overall earnings. Like people will still deploy, and if we create a good product that Helium Mobile is then able to use, and that generates a bunch of DC burn, that'll have a positive effect on the network overall. And just like we saw in April and May of 2021, what happened with the Helium network, like we could see something similar as data usage actually starts to increase. So I think we have to understand that there's outside forces that having a really good product for Helium Mobile as the kind of test bed for it, that'll also help spur some of the deployment of radios in areas that aren't boosted. Trying to not talk about price, but yeah.
Right, so absent that approach, then what Gateholder is talking about is basically a building, like it's an additional block to the hex boosting conversation that we have, in that we still want, because assuming that, like Helium Mobile is not going to be going in and like manually in the map, like, deboosting the hexes that are in the ocean and stuff like this. So there needs to be some oracle that says, okay, these are residential commercial areas and these are like non-zoned at all, or an oracle that's based on the mobile location data database of sorts, and say these are the general areas where people tend to dwell, and then you have that oracle boost hexes like universally, and then on top of that you have which kind of automatically devalues the hexes in the ocean and stuff like this. And then on top of that you have carriers on the network that literally use mobile, lock it into certain hexes, and boost them like another order of magnitude more, which again pulls the rewards further away from just anywhere and towards the boosted hexes, but it still allows people to just say, okay, well, I don't have the ability to deploy in the area that is specifically boosted, whatever, because I don't have the real estate access there, but I have some other location that potentially I think will become useful down the line, so I'm willing to invest ahead of the curve and just do it. So that's basically a combination of the oracle hex boosting and the carrier hex boosting.
Do we want to make
into one hex? Yeah.
Do we want to make the oracle hex boosting to start like just a binary, like either a 1 or a 0? So if it's the ocean, 0. If it's outside of the United States, 0.
Yeah.
If it's anywhere that there could be coverage, 1, and just keep it really simple to start.
Yeah, Max, I was kind of thinking the same thing because I was about to say that, or maybe they compromise it. I was just in my head, like I'm thinking of the carrier boosting as like the extra boosting, and then just like Max said, was thinking that the oracle could just be the deboosting of the obvious stuff, rather than. Because I think when you start trying to also add what to boost in the oracle piece, we're going to probably endlessly argue about what we hypothetically what we think is good coverage. It might be the best compromise to everybody, just to say, hey, carriers know where they want coverage, like boost that a lot, and then we know where they're just like we definitely do not need coverage and deboost that as quickly as possible. So yeah, anyway, I kind of agree where you're headed there, Max.
I think I like the idea of a multi-layered approach. That's even though it might be a little more work, it'll be very fair. It'll be very, and I think it'll be the most accurate of any of the approaches that we're kind of talking about. I think boosting, having the carriers having the ability to boost, and having oracles telling you where they think that should be boosted. That those things are very, very important. But I would also like to note that I was actually kind of surprised. I was looking at some third-party data about you, and I was actually weirdly surprised by how much amount of data is actually consumed on things like lakes and things like in port, like major port. Like that's actually a surprising number of surprising amount of data. I think in general, like coastline, yeah, that's probably not a good idea, but there are obvious exceptions to that. So I just want to put that out there. I wouldn't use a blanket term that if it's a water hex that equals.
Right.
No, but I think what we could do is we could say 5 miles off coast, anywhere. There's no radio that can cover it. 0 value, right? And then we can layer on more stuff. Like I think we want to have just a minimum viable product here that we could ship and start running with, and then as we collect more data, then we can make a more informed decision on what hexes of more value. I don't disagree with your overall opinion that we need to be a little more fine-tuned, but I don't think right now is the time. I think we can ship it with a binary scale and then go from there.
Right. I guess I do view it as a totally additive approach, where I think that as long as we kind of put it out there that we are going to do this, things are, as POC is going to ship version 1. I'm not that POC is going to ship. This is version 1. Version 1.1 is we're going to add the first oracle that gets built. I'm not exactly like it'll either be some. My hope was that something like a Google oracle that's just taking basic, very trivial data and just slapping it on there would work. Done in a week, or also just creating the portal for Helium Mobile, obviously after they launch, but that's going to be probably late May. So that's a long time to wait before we start getting, I'll call it, data flow. Also, I didn't know, Forrest. I know that Foundation's been Have we gotten word about what the SIM cards, like the eSIMs, are going to be doing? Are they going to relaunch shortly after?
Yeah, you're talking about the foundation sims.
Yes.
I don't really know the answer to that. If we have anybody from the foundation here, maybe they can comment or raise their hand, but I don't have direct visibility into that. But I hope yes.
Can I get clarification on something? Max alluded to the fact that the service provider is going to boost a hex, and if the data comes in the time that they say it, I wouldn't actually receive any extra proof of coverage POC rewards, right? Because the outcome was exactly as they promised. The only time that's what you kind of alluded to. I mean, I like it. I'm just kind of just trying to. I didn't know that that's what we were going for.
So there's two sides, right? There's the service provider who boosts the hex, and then there's the person who actually deploys the radio. The person who deploys the radio gets double. They basically get the added bonus of putting out the radio in a place with boosted hexes for proof of coverage, and then they also get the rewards for once that data starts flowing, that they get all those data rewards too. The only one who gets affected
is coming. Why give the rewards? The service provider promised there would be data. Once there's data, there should be no reason to pay. Because I was just thinking, I liked what you alluded to, because I'm thinking a service provider who is accurate, smart, and can predict the timing correctly, they could like constantly boost hexes, drive us to install, and really not spend very much because the data shows up exactly like they promised.
Well, they still don't spend. If the data actually shows up, they don't spend any more than they would, because their staked mobile ends up going back to them because they fulfilled their end of the agreement.
They led the horse to water, is the analogy.
Yeah. So
they only pay during the gap between when they boosted and when the data showed up.
It's essentially like a take or pay contract. If you're familiar with like oil and gas, where you essentially say that you're gonna get a certain amount of, in this case, a certain number of barrels of oil will be delivered. Whether or not you accept every barrel of oil, you still pay the amount that you would have paid had you accepted all of it. Does that make sense? So
that does.
Yeah. So essentially, we're asking the service providers if they want to have these hexes boosted because they feel they're important to them, that they essentially prepay for the data, have that locked up, and then if they do actually buy that data, then they get that staked mobile back.
Right, and I think that, yeah, so like we can play with the numbers a little bit. I think that like the boost needs to last a certain period of time, like irrespective, so you can boost it for 3 months, for 6 months, for a year, whatever. The mobile stays locked for that period of time, and the outsized rewards last for that period of time, irrespective of the data. And then there is certain threshold that needs to be hit in terms of a data amount that, can be counted as like, consistent amount of data over a period of time before it gets unlocked versus burned. But there is a period when whoever created coverage in that location, they get outsized rewards for both proof of coverage because it's boosted hex, as well as they're starting to get additional rewards in the form of data. And the reason for this to be the case is because, data, it's not like binary. There's like either, if you send like, one, kilobit of data in a month, it's not really like data, right? You may have gotten some rewards, but like this needs to be defined, right? There's going to be usually like a period too. So you put the coverage there, then the data's there and it starts growing data, etc. So there needs to be like, a period when it's boosted for. It's a clear period of time that's defined up front that says, I put in my radio there, I'll get outsized rewards for 6 months regardless. And if the data comes, I'll keep getting them plus the data rewards. But then after 6 months, basically the mobile gets unstaked and you just there reaping the data rewards.
And if the data doesn't come, the bonus stays, or they
If
just
the
get
data
kind of
doesn't come,
something
then the mobile gets burned, and the bonus does not stay. The bonus is kind of guaranteed for whatever, like we can create a table, right? But it's like a function of how much you've logged, can be a function of like how much it gets boosted and for how long. So let's say that we've logged, I don't know, 10,000 mobile in a particular hex. 10,000 mobile means that it's boosted 5x for 6 months. And that thing, once it's locked in, it's guaranteed. So if you've created coverage, from the moment coverage is created for 6 months, you have 6 months guaranteed of upgraded rewards, irrespective of whether data comes or not. If it comes to data, you get extra rewards for data. And then if the data comes in the amount that is, aligned with certain minimum that was set, that's part of this like lock contract, then the mobile gets unlocked and goes back to the service provider, but the coverage stays there. The person's happy because they're now actually making money by, providing coverage for a lot of data. If the threshold is not met, then the mobile gets burned, basically, because.
But then the operator gets sort of loses out, right? Because they got so I'm being aggressive
Right.
in my language, but they got tricked into going into this hex by the boost. The boost goes away after 3 months because that was all that was promised, and then no data shows up. The service provider loses their stake. I get that, but where am I at with the operator? I was quote promised.
Yeah, you got 6 months of outsized POC rewards.
Yeah, and going
that's
in,
it.
Keith, that's all you're guaranteed.
And
Okay.
that's it.
Fine.
You have there's like a likely expectation that there should be data, because like why would a service provider stake in that area if they don't think they're actually going to have data transfer? But yeah, I mean, as a deployer, you're only guaranteed what you're guaranteed.
Yes, I'm trying to think. There's another thing I'm kind of growing in my mind that's worrying, and that is what would be preventing somebody from becoming a service provider with lots of radios and just boosting their own squares.
Because if there's no data transfer, then you have the incremental rewards burned. Right. So
right, but I'm saying like literally all I would have to do is if I had known, like if so I go in with, I have a radio there and I know I've got data moving there, and I just boost my own hex and start getting outsized POC reward because of that.
Well, yeah, so to become a service provider, you need to, first of all, be voted in by the 5G sub-DAO to become one. You need to meet like certain criteria to explain like why you can be one and stuff like this. And you need to stake 500 million mobile to be the service provider. So it's like a pretty high bar to become one. So like every mom pop shop that just wants to like game the system willy-nilly will not be able to do that.
Sure. But I'm just saying, I'm pretty sure that's something I would be looking very closely at in terms of that we're gonna get a number of people.
Yeah, no, it's a reasonable concern. My gut feel is that's sort of like a day 2 concern, maybe day 3 concern.
Right.
Not an immediate concern. If we're like in a place where we have like service providers out the door and around the corner, and some of them are real and some of them are actually trying to game, like, we'll need to create another HIP or some mechanism for, either increasing the stake that the service provider needs to put up to become a service provider, or some clear-cut mechanisms need to be developed that specify how that stake gets burned if certain, inappropriate behaviors by the service provider are observed. Right. I think it's manageable, let's put it this way. We can figure that out. It's not a huge problem because there's already this pretty complicated gate of becoming a service provider to begin with. So It's not just like anybody can just become a service provider and start gaming immediately.
Right. I think that's kind of, I would agree. That's a down the road, but as long as we kind of always kind of have the eye on the potential shortcomings of that, I think that hopefully by the point that we start multiple service providers, that they would need to do that less and less. That kind of what your thinking is too.
Right. Yes. Okay. So one other topic I think to discuss that can go into this hex boosting locking hip is how many radios do we want to allow per hex? It's a little bit complicated topic because particularly when it comes with the indoor radios, there is a question of height, right? So, and the hex is like a two-dimensional thing. But let's maybe put that aside for a second, and let's say we have some like magical solution for it. I don't know if like whatever number we have right now, which is I think like 6, isn't it? 5, yeah, sorry, 5 is really ideal. I think it's too many, to be honest. We don't really need 5, especially now when there's no data on the network. It's really just like, a person with one roof is putting 5 radios there because why not? It doesn't really benefit the network, but more importantly, there isn't really sort of like a sense of ownership of the hex, which I think could really kind of like incentivize the network build out in this kind of like capture the flag type of fashion. Because, for example, let's say we have now, like right now it's not a really big deal because we don't really have like all the hexes are kind of the same, it doesn't matter. But let's say we have some hexes that have been boosted by the service provider, right? And that immediately means that they're like pretty valuable. They're like a valuable real estate. And a person goes through some hardship to, go like negotiate backhaul and find the location to create and cover this hex. They've covered the hex, they created coverage. But there isn't really like a very solid mechanism that's very well defined about like how this person actually continues to own this hex. Because they made this upfront investment, but like, hey, maybe your radio went offline for whatever a week because the power was out. Somebody else went in and put in another radio, and you're no longer in the top 5, although you were the first. So there isn't really a mechanism that defines it very clearly. And I think that as we start creating like hexes that are valuable, we need to have some sort of almost like capture the flag mechanism, so that here's this hex that's very valuable. And then a person who has been able to create coverage in that hex, they almost kind of like lay the claim to that hex, and it's like their real estate in the network. And unless they have screwed up or they have done something like malignant or they gamed it, like they keep claim to that hex. I think that's a potentially very like valuable mechanism. To first of all, incentivize people and to create coverage in locations that are relevant, but also kind of sort of create almost like this valuable real estate in terms of hexes, the ones that are boosted, the ones that have data, etc. I don't know if I have like a very concrete ideas about how to do that, except for me seeing that it's a problem that is currently not very clearly defined in how we approach it. And I think that there is a lot of value in solving it in a very crisp way, so that there's this kind of like capture the flag gamification of, trying to grab, like land grab good hexes and then continue to own them and continue to own, the rewards that are associated with this real estate.
Yeah. So before I get into kind of my thoughts, is the discovery mapping able to tell the height that people are at, to tell if maybe there's a high rise that people on multiple floors are using data, or is that like a limit
Yeah.
that it does?
Discovery mapping can reasonably accurately share the height because the phone has a pretty good ability to share. I mean, the phone has a GPS that's boosted by the usually like the Wi-Fi location data in addition. So, anything that the phone has the ability to tell, which height is part of it, we should be able to capture with discovery mapping.
Okay, so I think the service providers can layer that piece in, where if they notice that it's a bunch of varying heights in the same hex, that this is like a building that needs to have more than 5. I'm fine with lowering the number for every other situation if it's like street level stuff. What I would think on the capture the flag piece, I think we want to favor the best radio in terms of signal strength, and that can be done by who's closest and the most powerful radio, and then using how long ago it was deployed as the tiebreaker. This kind of happened with Pollen, where people set up the smaller radios, and then other people came in with bigger radios, and people understood that someone came in with a bigger radio. It wasn't like a huge deal for people to either move their radio or upgrade. In fact, it happened a lot of the times where people would upgrade the equipment they had on their sites so that no one else could come in and overpower their radios. So I think from a people getting upset that they deployed hardware and then someone else comes in with better hardware, I think that's a low risk in terms of people getting upset about that. And then, I don't know that being first is all that valuable if you're providing worse coverage, and if you have worse coverage than someone else who's more localized in a hex, or they have a higher powered radio, they're going to be the ones doing the actual data transfer. So we want to reward the person providing the best coverage.
I think Armand has some thoughts about this concept. Is there maybe Gay Holder, you want to give him the stage for a minute?
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add really quick is maybe also thinking about higher quality of service requirements for the boosted hexes. Maybe filter out and kind of push people towards the best possible setups.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Hey guys, appreciate the invitation up here. I'll be brief. I was working on a HIP for the IoT network that I think is partially relevant to this discussion and could be adapted to mobile. But the core of the idea is that the hotspot provider, if they want to claim that area, you want to align their incentives as much with the incentives of the network as possible, right? And one of the most important things for the network is knowing that that hotspot is going to be there for long term. So the core of the mechanism is you have someone stake their own mobile tokens to their hotspot for a term. That term can be 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. I don't know if there's one year amount that should exist or if there should be a variable term, but something that offers predictability. And they essentially get a rewards boost for doing that. And they only get that rewards boost if they continue offering service in that exact location. So they essentially incentivize themselves to align, and they receive a reward for doing that. And of course, you can mix that in with other things like the criteria that Max was describing as well.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea.
So maybe I should finish that HIP then.
What's the number? Is there a HIP for that's already there, or
No, it's a doc. It's a Google Doc, and it's definitely not ready for feedback yet. It needs to be fleshed out. But that's the core of the idea.
Always happy to help edit.
Yeah, it's kind of so it's probably need to think a little bit through the mechanics of how it works, but it's so basically you use mobile to sort of stake your claim to a hex. There is maybe some threshold for the quality of service that you need to meet in the hex in terms of the like reliability of the coverage that you provide and the signal strength that you provide. And as long as you're meeting it, you are able to basically continue to own this hex and get outsized rewards. But if you are not meeting it for whatever reason, then maybe there is some sort of like burn function similar to how we have it on the service provider side, where they've like, marked up the hex, but they didn't bring the data. Here's the same idea. I want to own this boosted hex. I've, staked certain amount of mobile. But for whatever reason, like I'm providing bad service, then some of that mobile gets burned, and eventually maybe like you're not able to own this hex anymore. Some mechanic along those lines.
Yes, exactly. And it allows the service provider, or excuse me, it allows the coverage provider to align themselves with the incentives of the network. So the prototype name I had for it is committed coverage. Essentially, you're committing to cover this area for X amount of time. And I think there's a lot of parameters that need to be honed in on. But a really important thing is that the cost to do this should be based on the average earnings in the network in some way. And it shouldn't be too expensive, right? This shouldn't be something that only really rich people do. It should be something that almost everyone can participate in. You want to have a really high participation rate for this in order to get the second order effect of essentially creating localized SLAs in the best way that we possibly can in this decentralized system.
Yeah, great idea.
So I'll drop that doc in the working group channel once it's more fleshed out.
Okay, cool.
Thanks, guys.
Okay, so let me maybe summarize some of the takeaways. So I think, again, like the main objective for us as the next big step is to produce a hip that does hex boosting and enables creation of more pointed coverage and enables people to get outsized rewards for providing coverage in places where there's most likely data usage that's going to happen. There are 3 inputs into this. One is service providers boosting hexes. The suggestion that I think I do like a lot is that you allow service providers to boost them as much as they want, but make it a function of the mobile that they lock in. So you can have like really outsized boosts certain locations, but that means that the service provider is risking a meaningful amount of mobile if there is not like a fairly high threshold of data usage that is met there. And the decisions on where the hexes are boosted is based on the discovery mapping data. Second, per gate holder is we still keep the idea of like an Oracle hex boosting to sort of trim the useless coverage as much as possible, in that we use something like the Google data around zoning or the mobile location data to have almost like a binary boost or like a very simple formula, not like with a service provider, but basically where the hexes that are obviously not very useful get next to nothing, and the hexes that are potentially useful get more at the expense of the useless hexes, give or take, simply by having like a more reward points going to the Oracle boosted hexes. And third component in that heap is that because we want people to be sort of committed to the coverage that they create in the boosted hexes, this is the Armon idea, is that enable people to actually also lock in mobile in the hexes that they want to kind of like own. and they're able to continue owning them as long as they meet a certain minimum threshold required for the hex for for this coverage to be sufficiently reliable and useful. So the next step would be then to aggregate all of these ideas and produce the next iteration of the hex boosting hip. Since it's a lot of ideas, probably will take a bit of time, like it'll take me at least a week, I think. So I'll try to draft it up by our next call on Thursday. And as soon as I have it, I'll just throw it out there. As soon as it's in readable, reviewable, feedbackable format. And then maybe we can have a more in-depth conversation about already something that was produced on paper by next call this week. Next week, I mean.
Do we want to make them separate hips or all one hip? My preference is always to have as few issues per hip as possible. Is there any downside to doing it that way?
Yeah, I do agree. I like to tackle things in small bite-sized chunks. So right now we have the carrier hex boosting, Oracle hex boosting, and committed coverage. Potentially 3 different hips that are all kind of interrelated, but they can be structured as 3 different hips.
Yeah, and then from a timing perspective too, we could just say we could pass the Oracle one if we do a simple binary scale. We can get that passed really quick. Whereas the service provider hip, we'll have to go back and forth and try to figure out the best way to do it. But I think there's a bunch of value in splitting them up.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed.
I think I would volunteer myself to attempt the, I guess, oracles that the not the model.
The Oracle boosting, yeah.
Yeah, that part of that I would be trying to work on and try to take some of the load off. I think that I've been working on some of it, and anybody else offer a data source, and also just how my main goal is to work out the math for how these oracles will, and they'll have to be closely, I think, tied to the other 2 factors. Though. How do you tie it all together?
Okay. Cool. Yeah, great. So you can just take the Oracle hex boosting bullet points that I've shared into the Discord last, and you can just start building on it. Because some of the basic concepts I've tried to lay down there already. But to the extent that they apply to how you're thinking of it, you can just build on it. It's probably the least mature in terms of the ideas put together, so there's a lot of creative freedom in building on that doc that I've shared.
Great, thanks.
Okay. I'll make it my goal then to get the carrier hex boosting polished based on the ideas that I heard so far. I don't know. Armand, do you want to tackle the committed coverage one? Or anybody else wants to tackle committed coverage one? Or should I do it?
I mean, I can try to refine what I currently have over the next couple days with mobile in mind, and then pass it on to you. And I'm happy to take edits from anyone in this group.
Yeah, that would be great.
All right, we'll share when I have something to share.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks again, everybody, for a productive meeting. And talk to everybody again on Thursday next week.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.